My name is Ian Kirkpatrick. I'm a Canadian artist, and I've been living in the UK since 2007. One thing I've sort of always found fascinating is just the history of art. So in my work, you often find lots of sort of graphics and sort of the forms of my work that respond to sort of historical artifacts. And often my work is actually sort of presented much like museum artifacts. So they're often sort of on plinths, sometimes sort of dramatically lit. And I like the way that you can see connections between the way sort of museum artifacts are presented and, say, products in a shop. So I really like that connection between sort of ancient museological pieces, modern commercial sort of objects, and art objects. There's a sort of a real kind of similarity in the way that we sort of prize and want to present objects. Much of my practice, I've been working in this sphere where you're looking at contemporary materials, the kind of objects that we produce in sort of everyday society, but sort of trying to find some sort of different way to kind of apply them that sort of says something about society, but also responds to sort of the history of sort of image making since sort of ancient times. Before I got into contemporary art, I was doing graphic design. But when I decided to bring it together with my contemporary art, I found that sort of I could use these sort of digital tools to really maximize the capacity to create sort of technical, intricate work, which can do things like flat pack. So a lot of my work can flat pack for storage and for transport. So I can send it off to a gallery in a different country and then just kind of put it back together quickly for the show and take it apart at the end. For this exhibition, MYTHOMANIA, I really wanted to do something sort of which was quite different from my previous work. So almost everything else I've done is sort of using sort of very kind of hard, kind of rigid materials. And I wanted to work basically with creating soft sculptures. I thought it would be really interesting to try pieces that kind of don't just sort of have quite as much of a geometric sort of feel, that have the sort of tactile effect of things like sort of clothing, handbags, sports bags, running shoes. Theme-wise, I really wanted to be able to find a way to take the work that I've been sort of doing over all these years and take that sort of big collection of sort of iconography and find some kind of common theme that I could use to sort of draw them all together and apply them onto the surfaces of the work. For me, myth is not just sort of gods, heroes and villains in that kind of sense, but it really invades every sort of aspect of life. There's many things that are, fictional, mythical, that either we believe in or at the very least that are part of our sort of culture. Although the exhibition is primarily focused on almost what you'd call like traditional myth and maybe sort of contemporary myth, I was also quite interested in things like sort of fake news and misinformation, which are obviously sort of very important today. And I wanted to kind of create work that responded really to contemporary events and hopefully, helps to kind of open that sort of dialogue about, what's important in the world today, where we want to go, and, and the kinds of important things that, society needs to do in order to kind of move forward in a positive way. I sort of wanted to sort of produce a series of pieces that in some ways kind of could be read all together, so that if you look at all the artworks in MYTHOMANIA, you kind of can find sort of common themes, but also I wanted each piece hopefully to be able to stand alone. One of the artworks, which is shaped like a big eagle and is called Quest for Fire, I was really interested in sort of the ideas of the origins of sort of creativity, the origins of intellect, and that sort of quest that people have always had to succeed, to conquer, to get ahead. I'm designing all the sculptures, the new sculptures, out of artificial leathers and other materials. And all the graphics are actually being produced as like embroidery patches. So I could turn my vector graphics into sort of stitched sort of designs. I could sort of cut those out just like you would see patches on a jacket. But I've kind of built this sort of big narrative surface that reads very much like my other sculptures, but I think hopefully adds something quite different, quite physical to these works. So once I basically had sketched those out just by hand, just in my notebook, I then began sort of drawing them more sort of in a more detailed fashion in Adobe Illustrator. And this allowed me to kind of get a kind of an accurate feeling of the scale and the proportions of the pieces. And from that, it allowed me to kind of be able to actually create the sort of the stitching pattern. Normally when I produce work, say for sort of cardboard sculptures, I build them just as you would sort of see unfolded cardboard boxes. So I don't design them in 3 dimensions, I design them in 2 dimensions. And in some ways it gives me a lot more control over how the sculpture is going to fold together. But in other ways it's a bit disorienting because you don't actually see the finished product as you're designing it. And this was very much the same way, but with cloth it works even differently. Each facet of the sculpture is really its own piece in most cases. So actually the artworks were very much like exploded views of the finished product. With those individual pieces, I then sort of laid them out into a kind of a pattern so I could see how they would fit on a roll of cloth. I ordered big meters and meters of artificial leathers, so it's a really kind of strong material and it has the kind of weight I'm looking for. But some of the sculptures have 16 meters of artificial leather in a roll, you know, sort of supporting them. So I then sort of cut those patterns out into the leather, and then they also included things like sort of where to stitch and where to add the iconography. I then took all those sort of pieces and I did then apply sort of the graphics. So each of my graphics was having to kind of be produced separately by hand. I would take the graphic, I would import it into a program called SewArt, which allows me to kind of take a raster graphic, which is like a pixelated graphic, and turn it into a stitching file. That I then sort of use on my embroidery machine. The embroidery machine basically takes any design that you can create and it stitches it out for you. So for me it's really fantastic to be able to kind of see my work produced in a different format just than on paper or even on metal. You know, there's something quite physical about the stitching which I really like. Then I cut the patches out. I then apply them onto the surface of the artificial leather, you know, and not just in a kind of a random pattern, but based on the sort of the original sort of design. So that everything is quite controlled, and you know, so it's an interesting kind of process for me in the sense that you know, you have this kind of master plan and everything's having to kind of fit into it perfectly in order to make it all come together. So it's quite different for me, but it's also sort of very exciting. Although they're based on sort of familiar forms, like sort of luggage and purses and shoes, they're sort of enlarged to a size that's very unnatural. So I'm hoping that people, when they see these works, recognize them as alluding to fashion design, alluding to things that you would see in everyday life, but they have a very sort of strange effect. And I hope that's where the power of the work comes from, and that is what people can enjoy about Mythomania.